One of the issues creeping into Philadelphia's 7th Ward was an issue affecting the family structure. The new environment of city living was quickly changing the way many blacks got involved with and even looked at marriage. And as a result, it created a complex set of issues and a strain on the community. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois pinpoints some of these problems in his 1899 book titled The Philadelphia Negro. Here we go. For a people comparatively low in the scale of civilization, there is a large proportion of single men. More than in Great Britain, France, or Germany. The number of married women, too, is small, while the large number of widowed and separated indicates widespread and early breaking up of family life. Here's a chart that shows the statistics he gathered from the 7th Ward. We can see here that 41.4% of the men and 30.5% of the females were single. 52.5% of the males and 47.1% of the females were married. And then 6.1% of the males and 22.4% of the females were widowed or permanently separated. And these stats include male and females over the age of 15. The number of single women is probably lessened by unfortunate girls, and increased somewhat by deserted wives who report themselves as single. Some of the data might be a bit misleading because some of the unfortunate girls, which was a common euphemism for prostitutes, may have had informal partnerships and reported themselves as married. And at the same time, there were deserted wives who reported themselves as single, although they were in fact married or separated. So basically he's saying that because of this, the data is not an exact reflection of the reality. The number of deserted wives, however, allowing for false reports, is astoundingly large and presents many intricate problems. Now, what is considered a deserted wife? When the husband takes off somewhere with no intention of returning, or leaves the marriage with no intent of reconciling, and the woman is not in support of that decision. A very large part of charity given to Negroes is asked for this reason. The causes of desertion are partly laxity in morals and partly the difficulty of supporting a family. Some men deserted because of laxity in morals, meaning they left their wives because they didn't value marriage and the responsibility to a family, at least high enough. Or they took off due to economic difficulties, like not being able to find a job to support their family. So in the face of financial pressure, they left the area or the city and they went somewhere else without their family, right? These are the two factors Dr. Du Bois believes contributed to the astoundingly large number of deserted women. The lax moral habits of the slave regime still show themselves in a large amount of cohabitation without marriage. The way relationships were formed in slavery was still showing up in the manner in which many of their descendants approached marriage, which was partners living together without a formal marriage. In the slum districts, there are many such families, which remain together years and are in effect common law marriages. That's back there on 7th Street in Lombard. They had couples living together for years and were essentially married, but without the backing of any formal recognition. Some of these connections are broken by whim or desire, although in many cases they are permanent unions. It's like a boyfriend and girlfriend in high school. You can get rid of them at any time because there's nothing formal about it. No paperwork, no court proceedings, no documents, no fees or anything like that to create burdens in the process of dissolving the relationship. But in the same sense, these informal relationships could form into something permanent, which Dr. Du Bois says was the case with many of these unions. The economic difficulties arise continually among young waiters and servant girls. Away from home and oppressed by the peculiar lonesomeness of a great city, they form chance acquaintances here and there, thoughtlessly marry, and soon find that the husband's income cannot alone support a family. Then comes a struggle which generally results in the wife's turning laundress, but often results in desertion or voluntary separation. This here is referring to young women coming from the rural areas into the city. They find themselves lonely in the city and begin dating around and then thoughtlessly jumping into marriages to fill a void. He's explaining marriages that came about more so incidentally and not planned and really thought out, right? Then once she realizes that the person she married couldn't support a family, then the arguments began, the fighting and the bickering, and she eventually had to pick up another job of washing clothes. But often she gets deserted in the process, or they decide to go their own way. The great number of widows is noticeable. Here he reports 200 men and 841 women as widows. That represents nearly 21% of the women reported as widows. The conditions of life for men are much harder than for women, and they have consequently a much higher death rate. Unacknowledged desertion and separation also increases this total. Then, too, a large number of these widows are simply unmarried mothers, and thus represent the unchastity of a large number of women. Women who had children with men they weren't married to, but still reported themselves as widows when the man died. The result of this large number of homes without husbands is to increase the burden of charity and benevolence. He mentioned earlier that a very large portion of charity was provided to Negroes for this reason, and also on account of their poor home life to increase crime. One less parent to help raise the child. It's already hard enough with two parents, but it's even more difficult with only a mother. That's how you get the influences from the people in the street sliding on in and taking on the missing paternal role. And as a result, an increase in crime. Here is a wide field for social regeneration. In what areas? Crime, poverty, and the family structure. This was the wide field for the Negroes to socially rebuild themselves from the dust of the ground. When we remember that in slavery time slaves usually began to cohabit at an early age, these figures indicate the sudden and somewhat disastrous application of the preventive check to population through the economic stress of life in large cities. Here's the chart he's referring to. He's saying that city life abruptly changed the way blacks formed families and conceived children. In slavery, they started out young, out of necessity, but the new generation living in the city delayed starting families because they wanted to have more resources before they settled down, which to me seems reasonable. But Dr. Du Bois is stating that this had a negative impact on blacks, and this is why. Negro girls no longer marry in their teens as their mothers and grandmothers did. Of those in the 20s, over 40% are still unmarried, and of those in the 30s, 21%. So sudden a change in marriage customs means grave dangers, as shown by the fact that 45 of the married couples under 40 were permanently separated and 239 women were widowed. That's right here, combining the 23 and the 22 separated women to get the 45 permanently separated couples in this age range, and 192 with the 47 to get the 239 widowed women within the same age range. And what he's implying here is that they weren't adapting well to the new city environment, which created fast changes in their marital tradition, right? So for them, waiting longer to marry had a negative effect on the quality of those marriages formed and on the consequences of those marriages, being that many of the men were dying at a higher rate and leaving the women widowed without much support, right? Here it is plain that although a large percent of men under 40 marry, there is nevertheless a number who wait until they are settled in life and have a competence. His data shows that 45.3% of black men were married at or before the age of 40. Then it increases to 73.9% who were married between the ages of 40 and 60. So a good-sized portion of the men waited until they were a bit older and felt themselves to be more stable before they married. And Dr. Du Bois states that the problem with that was this. With the mass of Negroes, however, the waiting past the 40th year means simply increased caution about marriage. They were looking at the women as a risk, and they were unsure if they wanted to tie themselves down with one of them. So they looked at marriage with increased caution, or if they are widowers, about remarriage. They already been down that road and they were hesitant about traveling it again. Or maybe they were still in love with their wife that had passed away and they didn't have any room for anyone else, right? It could be either one of these options, along with others that made them cautious about remarriage. Consequently, while, for instance, in Germany, 84.8% of the men from 40 to 60 are married, among the Negroes of this ward, less than 74% are married. At the same time, there are indications of a large number of broken marriage ties. Of the men under 40, the bulk marry late, that is, in the 30s. His data shows 66% marry in their 30s, which was late in comparison to the customs they had in the country. And again, he sees delayed marriage as having a negative effect on the black community, because of the way it shaped the family structure. The longer they waited increased the risk of the family falling and failing due to the high death rate in the men, which left women without support for herself and the children, right? And without a father, the children were at an increased risk to get into crime. And also, the longer the men waited, the more they viewed marriage with caution. And Dr. Du Bois sees the main factor contributing to this cultural shift being the economic hardship faced by Negroes in Philadelphia, right? That's what made them feel like they needed to marry later, right? So hopefully that's a bit clear. Turning now to the women, we have a table in which the noticeable feature is the extraordinary number of widowed and separated persons, indicating economic stress, a high death rate, and lax morality. You see here? The women between 40 and 60 have combined separation and widow statistics of 43.5%, and over 60 it increased to 80.1%, which he interprets as a result of not enough access to jobs, the men dying at higher rates, and the people marrying each other without really valuing what marriage is intended to represent. Such are the social results of a large excess of young women in a city where young men cannot afford to marry. These statistics are the best measurements of the condition and tendencies of the Negro home which we have, and although they are crude and difficult in some cases rightly to interpret, yet they shed much light on the problem. First, it must be remembered that the Negro home and the stable marriage state is, for the mass of the colored people of the country and for a large percent of those of Philadelphia, a new social institution. Because for many in slavery, they could be married with someone on the plantation, then the spouse could be sold to another plantation, where eventually they both might remarry, right? Now, this didn't happen to everyone, but it did for many. So for many of the enslaved, there wasn't a lot of marriage stability promoted in that environment. That's why he states that this was a new social institution for them. The strictly guarded savage home life of Africa, which with all its shortcomings protected womanhood, was broken up completely by the slave ship and the promiscuous herding of the West Indian plantation put in its stead. The vast majority of any culture from Africa didn't last long in the United States under the rugged 9.0 super slavery they had to endure, right? All of that was beaten out of them, including their marriage tradition, which was replaced. From this evolved the Virginia plantation, where the double row of little slave cabins were but parts of a communistic paternalism centering in the big house, which was the real center of the family life. The slave cabins were the extension of the big house, where the slave master lived and ruled over the plantation. He's saying this to point out how they were dependent on their masters and how they lacked the autonomy to shape their own family and social structure. Even in Pennsylvania, where the plantation system never was developed, the slave family was dependent in morals as well as work upon the master. With emancipation, the Negro family was first made independent, and with the migration to cities, we see for the first time the thoroughly independent Negro family. On the whole, it is a more successful institution than we had a right to expect, even though the Negro has had a couple of centuries of contact with some phases of the monogamic ideal. The great weakness of the Negro family is still lack of respect for the marriage bond, inconsiderate entrance into it, and bad household economy and family government. Sexual looseness then arises as a secondary consequence, bringing adultery and prostitution in its train, and these results come largely from the postponement of marriage among the young. Such are the fruits of sudden social revolution. That's pretty much the summary of everything that we've gone over today. There can be no doubt but what sexual looseness is today the prevailing sin of the mass of the Negro population, and that its prevalence can be traced to bad home life in most cases. Children are allowed on the street night and day unattended. Same thing in many areas today. You can't just let the children run around in the streets, or even give unlimited freedom for the children to explore the internet freely, right? They have to be guided and shown the way until they reach a certain age to start learning the ways of independence. Parenting is a skill because you are helping to mold a human. When the kids are allowed to mold themselves out in the streets, then that's how you get a lot of the wild stuff we see happening today from the teenagers and the young men, right? That's why you have to have a strong community built on morals, values, and principles that direct people away from that. But when you have a community that directs people towards that, then how can you be surprised with the outcome? Loose talk is often indulged in. The sin is seldom, if ever, denounced in the churches. The same freedom is allowed the poorly trained colored girl as the white girl who has come through a strict home, and the result is that the colored girl more often falls. Nothing but strict home life can avail in such cases. Of course, there is much to be said in palliation. The negress is not respected by men as white girls are, and consequently has no such general social protection. As a servant, maid, etc., she has peculiar temptations. Especially the whole tendency of the situation of the Negro is to kill his self-respect, which is the greatest safeguard of female chastity. So the responsibility is with the men and the women both, to help out one another, to complement instead of competing with each other, right? What we're seeing right now are the seeds of the breakdown of the emancipated family in the Seventh Ward. We're seeing the early stages of something worse to come if it's not fixed from the foundation. Because once the negative habits and customs begin to spread, it's like wildfire and it's hard to put out. This is why Dr. Du Bois made the effort to make these points in his book, right? He understood the implications of this situation if it was allowed to continue, okay? So from here, we're going to stop and we're going to pick up in the next commentary. I thank you for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.